Hi, this is Karl-James Langford, channel 012975. We've got a video log today on the 27th of February 2015 looking at the collection, export and return of cultural property. And it's very contentious at this minute when we're seeing the destruction in the name of the Islamic State of archaeological collections at Mosul Museum, which was on Channel 4 on Thursday. And the destruction was quite heinous, and the destruction of the archaeological site of the Assyrian kings at Nineveh. So we won't be mentioning that too much, but this lecture that I've prepared with images will help you decide your own thoughts on this. So this is my teaching this week, and this isn't my opinion. This is just a lecture. Hopefully you enjoy. The illicit collection and export of cultural property. First image helps us to glide into this lecture today is the British Museum in the 1800s. As interest in the study and collection of antiquities developed in the Western world from the late 1600s onwards, so the looting of archaeological sites became increasingly common, particularly at home. The British Museum and other major Western institutions are filled with antiquities from all over the world, and some of those we will see today. So the next image that's the British Museum as we see it today, and the interest in antiquities very much began at home. With our great sites here, such as Hadrian's Wall, this image by William Stukeley, the antiquarian from the mid-16 and early 1700s. He would go around sketching these sites. And many individuals started excavating onto sites such as Avebury, many prehistoric sites, and the Roman villa sites, for example, on the Isle of Wight. And it was a Sunday pastime where people would go to these sites, and a family may on a Sunday, for example, open up a round barrow on Cranbourne Chase, or one of the round barrows, for example, at Stonehenge. Archaeology at that time was seen to be very romantic and something that everybody wished to acquire in one way, shape, form or another. So when stones were stopped being taken from, say, Hadrian's Wall and Stonehenge and Avebury and varying other sites in Great Britain, people felt a need to dig below the surface. And then as Britain expanded, and as many other countries in Europe expanded, they would find new areas where they could take artifacts from. People saw the past as very romantic and something that they wished to acquire. Whole monuments ended up on people's estates being rebuilt, taken, and as the world started to be explored, antiquities taken from abroad, completely alien to our landscape. Giovanni Battista Bellinzoni was one of those individuals by 1817 would see the acquirement of the Memnon from Egypt. He was part of the dash to get these antiquities over to this new museum, the British Museum, which is full of the world treasures today. But people were still interested at home, but they felt they could get more abroad. This is William Stukeley himself, lived from 1687 to 1765. Nobody could dispute this map. A quarter of the world's map once was covered in red or pink, representing the extent of the colonial empire of the British. The activities of travellers and traders weren't just restricted to British travellers and traders. It went, for example, over to French colonies, later on German colonies, Italian colonies, Spanish colonies and so on. And the growth of a class of wealthy private collectors made it possible to amass huge collections of objects. Great Britain holds many of the world's major cultural treasures, largely because of its colonial past. However, many were also acquired as a direct result of long-distance archaeological raids. Great Britain, as we've already said, was not alone in carrying out such enterprises, and all the European countries which maintained colonial interest abroad mounted archaeological expeditions and amassed collections containing items which are of specific cultural significance to their homelands. The dash for Africa in the late 1870s was one such acquirement. But in an age when archaeology was growing and understanding the needs of local people and the archaeology, objects were often collected in a spirit of intense competition, which served to hasten destruction and removal of cultural property. It's always seen that the British are the biggest criminals in all this. And we should ask the question, is the capture of these objects for the British Museum in the 1800s and 1900s very much different from what ISIS is doing now in Syria and Iraq, selling off their archaeology to countries that want them and they don't want them? As a point of fact, they've destroyed many statues in Syria and Iraq, but the trade now is to make money for ISIS to continue the war against the West. Understandably, many countries are now demanding the return of such cultural property. We now turn to Cleopatra's Needle. The Egyptian government has constantly requested set up on the bank of the River Thames in London. We've got a couple of images here. 1870 to 2008. We see some damage caused to this great monument, Cleopatra's Needle, taken from Egypt in the 1870s. And we've got an image here showing the ship that was used to transport it to the banks of the River Thames into the British Museum. Egyptians argue that the monument has been damaged by being left outside because we've got carbon monoxide damaging the monument. But then again, with the events of 2011 in Egypt, would the monument be more safer there in a time of violence? So this is a great big question. No rights or wrongs. It's for you to make your mind up. In Athens, a museum is being constructed in the hope that it will eventually house the marble sculptures from the Parthenon taken by Lord Elgin at the beginning of the 1800s. Lord Elgin acquired the marbles at great expense to himself, making himself bankrupt, eventually selling them at a loss to the British government. These now are of pride of place in the British Museum, but the Greeks wish to see them adorning their own museum. Some more of the marbles. This is the more naked museum that we find in Athens today for the Parthenon. There are many arguments for and against the restitution of such cultural property, which are raised by the very case of the Elgin marbles. Maybe the plan is to swap the replicas in the Athens Museum with the originals, and we could display the replicas in this country. Alas, with the present economic problems in Greece today, it's unlikely that's going to happen. It's said by some that if we do return the Elgin marbles to Greece now, they'll simply be sold on to deal with some of the country's debts. The illicit removal of cultural property is of course a major problem. Palmyra protected by the Syrian government still, against the odds, against ISIS. As you can see, this image shows a Syrian soldier guarding the site. But it's not about saving these monuments, it's about people as well. And many of these archaeological monuments are used by peoples in Syria and Iraq as places of safety. So you've got to give the role of the people to the living rather than the archaeology today. So if damage is caused to these archaeological sites by people, then maybe so be it. In addition to its cultural value, heritage is also a commodity within the modern Western world. The size of the trade in illegal obtained cultural property is vast, and most of it derives from robbed archaeological sites and the theft of objects from institutions and private collections. Next turn to Costa Rica. A recent estimate suggests that almost 95% of all known archaeological sites in Costa Rica have been plundered. Even though this image shows a Cambodian family looting archaeological sites in that country, there are whole families doing the same in Costa Rica and across South America and Central America, where Costa Rica is to be found, looking at the images of the map. The point being made is that there are whole families who are so desperate that they no longer see their history and archaeology as being important because it's been so plundered by the West anyway. So it's no longer important to them. So it's a way of making a quick buck. There are whole grave robber unions in Central and South America protecting those that are up to be prosecuted. The problem is with modern day archaeology is that we're using LiDAR and aerial photography, which comes up with new sites, and of course ground penetrating radar. These are all published on the internet and people then go there to loot the sites. So archaeology is actually causing the damage to these sites by publishing their results. More to keep it private like the old days, when only people have access to the records if they're an archaeologist. Sounds pompous, eh? But maybe if that's the way to protect these sites, that's the way to do it. In India, between 1977 and 1979, there were 3,000 thefts of antiquities reported, yet only 10 cases were solved. Case of this statue from a temple in India, 900 years old, is that this temple had a statue taken right under the noses of the people worshipping at the site. The original statue went to Australia, where a replica was placed there. The people feel disconnected from the statue now, because they feel they've been robbed of their own cultural heritage. However, looting is not something that is restricted to developing countries. In Italy, for example, Etruscan tombs that I've looked at in another video log have been extensively robbed, as we see some images here, with organised crime being implicated in the trade in these antiquities. Many large of these artefacts have been captured by the Italian government before they've gone to Switzerland, never to be placed on display again until the original tombs or owners of these archaeological pieces of evidence are to be found. And the law has it that if you find an artifact going on to the market for trade and it's intercepted, it is placed into a store until the rightful site or owner is found. Again, artifacts of great quality may never see the light again. Organised crime has been implicated in these antiquities. You can see this in Italy. In many developing countries, the culprits are often local impoverished peasants who earn very small sums of money in return for looting these sites. These activities are usually organised by middlemen and dealers who purchase the objects from the peasants for a pittance and sell them on at hugely inflated prices to dealers in Western countries. The looting of sites in many countries has been exacerbated since the conflict 2003. The American army and the local peoples of Iraq have been implicated in the organised theft from the Baghdad Museum and various other museums across Iraq, thanks to the invasion 2003. This illegal invasion meant that people in the West could acquire ancient goods from these museums. They were well aware that if they destroyed the records, as you can see in this image of the filing cabinets, then nobody could trace the object back to the museum, meaning that these goods could go onto the Western market, places like Switzerland, to be sold. millions and millions of pounds was made by selling objects from the Baghdad Museum which will never ever be rehoused there, because there's no proof that they were ever from there in the first place, because the records were destroyed. Even though that we got imagery that could help today, it was too late. You put an image for sale on the internet, you can use imagery software to track it on eBay, hence track it back to the original museum, but that software was not available, and records not pertaining to the Baghdad Museum were ever made that openly accessible. Despite of tough legislation and serious measures taken in many countries, the problem continues to grow. A major problem lies in enforcing laws, since the financial incentives to carry out the trade is so great. The problem is further exacerbated by the great variation in legislation, national and local laws across the world. More images of the destruction in the Baghdad Museum. This is one of the storage rooms. This is something that's happened in Mosul in the past year as well. This happened in 2003. People knew what they were looking for. They simply destroyed the things that they couldn't take out of the museum, the things that they didn't think could fence. And they simply sold these onto the international market, along with American servicemen who would have stuffed their knapsacks with this stuff, not being searched on the way back to the US. A tank, a bit late. 3 men in a tank to protect the museum from being looted. People couldn't take statues away, they'd simply break the heads off and sell them instead. This is once the saviour of Iraqi archaeology, Saddam Hussein. When he fell from power, his country was actively looted, thanks to the West's invasion, illegal invasion of Iraq. Another statue, unable to be moved in its entirety, the head was just taken away. We simply look towards Egypt after 2011. Again, more destruction to museums. There were whole museums such as this display in a very out of the way museum, probably by an organised group of people who simply took the goods away from the museum. 95% of all objects were taken and then sold. Very little. You can see bits of wicker baskets and stuff on the floor of ancient times which are now deteriorating. This is a damage caused by looters, by people who should pride themselves in this cultural heritage, but we have caused and exacerbated a problem by taking goods in the first place. In many cases, a destination, as I've already said, for these illicitly obtained objects are the art dealers and auction houses in the West, particularly in the UK, US, Switzerland, Germany, France and other places. Switzerland, there is no restriction on the import or export of works of art and cultural heritage, making it a leading centre for the sale of stolen objects. UNESCO was established to protect the archaeologies of the world. UNESCO was established in the 1970s. United Nations educational, scientific and cultural organisation with 2 centering principles. All removals of property as the result of previous colonisation of newly independent states were to be returned, and the issue of the continued illicit worldwide traffic in art treasures was to be dealt with. But not all countries signed up to every single word in the UNESCO conventions, and the United States and Britain were 2 of those. Therefore, they don't have to return their goods from their national museums today. Moving on briefly, and towards the end of this lecture, we need to look at something else. On a national level, most countries don't work together. I like this image when I saw it. Stop the plunder of China's cultural heritage. It seems that China above all has the right approach. National legislation. In addition to international agreements, most countries have international legislation regarding the ownership of and trade in portable antiquities. There are essentially 3 approaches. Firstly, the British approach itself gives priority to the private right of property rather than the public interest in cultural property. However, if the site is a scheduled ancient monument, then the artefacts themselves cannot be removed from the site without prior permission of the Secretary of State, and therefore also they belong to the nation. However, if artefacts are found outside a scheduled ancient monument, which is usual, then it looks at the Treasure Bill from 1996, and the basic principle is that any objects containing gold and silver and objects of other materials found with them, irrespective of whether they were considered to have been buried with the intention of recovery, were to be classed as treasure. And usually that encourages metal detecting and people to damage non-protected sites with the intention of making money out of their hobby, which is quite tragic. The state usually uses very delicate resources from museums away from staffing to pay for these artefacts, when in fact we've got too many artefacts on display in our museums as there is. The other two areas of national legislation found in other countries are to be seen as follows. Second approach involves a recognition that there are both private and public interests in objects of antiquity. For example, a Spanish constitution. For example, the Spanish Constitution under Article 46 states that there is public commitment to the conservation of the cultural heritage regardless of ownership. Spain allows for the classification of antiquities into two categories. Material declared to be of cultural interest may be privately owned, but can under no circumstances be exported and cannot be sold except to a museum. The owner must permit inspection, study and viewing by the public. And I'm sure people wouldn't want that every year, so it'd be better off in a museum. Next, also to do with Spain, material and general inventory must be made available for up to 2 months of the year for inspection, research and display. The government must be informed of any transfer of ownership. Such material cannot be exported without a license, and any application for a license carries an implicit offer to sell the object to the state. And the third form of national legislation, this is where the image of stop the plunder of China's cultural heritage comes into it. May be seen draconian, but this is something I completely agree with, that declares that all antiquities found on any site in your country are to be seen as the property of the state. For example, such laws exist in Turkey. But Turkey's laws are not strictly adhered to, but in China, if artefacts are found in an archaeological site and they're smuggled out of the country or sold, obviously illegally, because all antiquities belong to the state, carries a possible death sentence. And I'm sure if that happened in this country, metal detecting would become extinct overnight. This is the end of this lecture today. However, next week's lecture looks at human remains as cultural resources. How do we treat human remains and the artefacts with them? And that's what we'll be looking at. Thank you for listening to this lecture today, and hopefully it's informed you of the issues involved in archaeology in the ground around the world. Thanks for watching the video log today, and may you continue, and may you give your comments as well. And those that wish to subscribe, thank you very much.